Should come right out. Please join me on stage. Sorry to put my back to the audience. But, you know, we did not intend this conference to be a relentless assault on Facebook, Amazon, and Google. If you read the article that I wrote in our magazine, you'll see that, I mean, I try to be nuanced myself. But it is interesting the degree to which the concerns have risen close to the surface in the last couple of days. And so, you know, I did tell the panelists backstage one of the things I'd like them to talk about, since they've all been here, is, you know, what they think about the dialogue we've had over the last couple of days at any level, and or really on any topic, since you know, this is the penultimate session here. In terms of what we are approximately up here to discuss, the way, even though the title is The Internet Under Attack, I think of it probably more to be about, we now have an interstitial tissue for global society, which we call the Internet, which has fundamentally changed the landscape of society, politics, and the economy. So what does that mean, and where does it go next, given the panoply of challenges and threats that exist? And there are many which you will hear us discuss. So maybe we should start by just, you know, either addressing either one of those two things is, you know, your prerogative. But I would just ask, let's start with Mark and just go down the, no, let's start you. With
sure.
You. Sorry, Rebecca, I'm sorry, Rebecca McKinnon, Peter Junk?
Junk.
Yeah, who, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce the panelists. I'm so sorry. Most people have heard Rebecca McKinnon talk at some of our sessions. She runs the Ranking Digital Rights Project at New America, which really aims to assess what technology companies are doing and how well they're doing it, particularly in the area of privacy, but in other areas as well. Petter is the Chief Technology Officer of BAE Systems Intelligence and Security, which is, BAE is a giant British aerospace company that has a very big government contracting business in the US, which is the part that he works for and is the Chief Technology Officer for. He has a long background in the advertising industry, which gives him an interesting perspective, as you'll hear. Mark Anderson is the CEO of Strategic News Service, a longtime journalist, consultant, pundit on technology, and the operator and the host of probably the only other conference I know of where the kinds of things we've talked about so freely here would routinely come up, called Future in Review, that this has been happening for 13 years now. So he and I are somewhat blood brothers in this business. Anyway, so now, Rebecca.
Thank you, David.
Also, she used to be CNN's Beijing bureau chief,
yep, long
and
ago.
has done a bunch of other interesting things, which I meant. Oh, she wrote a book called Consent of the Networked, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. So there you go.
Thank you, David. As it happens in Consent of the Network, which was published more than 5 years ago now, I had several warnings in that book, and one of them I illustrated with a slide that I often gave in talks that I think would be useful to reprise here. And the slide has kind of a circle with democratic countries here and authoritarian countries here. And the assumption, the narrative sort of, I think, not just in Silicon Valley, but in policy circles, in media, for a very long time, which I contributed to back in the 90s when the internet showed up in China. And it's like, there's no way the Chinese Communist Party can survive this. Boy, were we wrong, right? But there's been this assumption that, you know, you've got democracy here and you've got authoritarian societies here. And that because the internet and because capitalism, the authoritarian societies are inevitably and inexorably going to end up over here in the democratic side. What I've been warning about for some time is that if we're not careful, actually we're going to meet in the middle. That you're going to have authoritarianism adapt to the internet, not only survive and thrive, but adapt the internet to its purposes. And we see China as exhibit A for how that works. Meanwhile, democracy kind of moves towards, you know, driven by populist leaders, you know, all kinds of different forces, surveillance, capitalism, et cetera, ends up following, you know, becoming less democratic, and is in this kind of manipulated, maybe you call it authoritarianism, maybe you call it populist, quasi-democratic, whatever you call it. But basically the differences between authoritarian society and democratic society are going to break down unless we very consciously and actively work to prevent that from happening. And I think events of the past year have shown kind of where that's going. I think there's a couple other trends that are going on that we need to think about, and you sort of suggested that we think beyond just bashing the tech companies. And I think we need to be careful about some of the regulatory reactions and responses, and I think there have been some very important proposals put forward at this conference and elsewhere about the need for more transparency around algorithms, around data collection, around advertising and so on. But there's also been a lot of regulatory proposals by well-meaning politicians and democratic societies calling on, placing greater liability on internet platforms, calling for censorship, essentially. Censorship systems that are going to be very welcome around the world by many non-democratic nations, as making it easier for them then to impose laws on Facebook and Twitter and Google's properties to crack down on society.
Yeah.
And this is part of the problem. Internet under attack, it's really civil society under attack, because civil society in the past decade has been very successful in using the internet in challenging authority. And now authority is fighting back. They've figured out how to use the technology to fight back. And at the same time, you've got a clash of kind of nation states clashing with kind of global sovereignties of internet companies, and nation states figuring out how to use these globally internet platforms to carry out information wars against one another. And we don't have sort of either legal and regulatory systems or political systems or ways of sort of holding power accountable that's actually going to serve the, further human rights, democratic and open societies. And we need to figure this out fast, or we're going to meet in that middle and get stuck there.
Okay, one quick point to underscore this idea that the societies are fighting back. It's been reported, but it's not as widely discussed as perhaps it should be, that Facebook was about to launch in China in partnership with Baidu in the spring of 2011. There was a lot of movement. They were very far along that path. The Chinese leadership saw what happened in the Arab Spring that winter, and they put the kibosh on it. And that's exactly the kind of movement you're describing. They were very wise. They knew what was coming. They understood. And they acted in their own interest.
And they don't need Facebook because they've got Chinese alternatives.
Well, that's something else.
The one thing I would react to is I would say that, I don't know how governments will all merge and how the population will get to the middle, but the internet is definitely in the middle of both of these worlds, so the authoritarian governments and kind of the West. What I would say, though, is we need to be aware, and I think you can see for $200 worth of rubles, you can go and influence something, that the open ecosystem of social media we have created and the copies like VK and Alibaba and all the rest that exist around the globe were built to produce brands, whether to defend them or to be able to go and socialize those things. And governments care about producing brands and feelings within people, and we've made it so it's the lowest cost to be able to go sell something, which might be a vision, a message, a riot, whatever it may be from that piece. What we need to step back is to take a look at not even just here's the technology, because we can regulate Facebook, but are you going to regulate every other one of the 1,000 social media companies that aren't even based in the West? You're just going to see an influence of something going around. But realize, what you have is, while in China they may want to go and control what the social media company does, in many ways they'd like to figure out much more what their dissidents are doing outside of that country. And what we've done is served them up on a platter as an ad. Let me find everybody who's got this type of interest to where we go and do. And I think this is where I think we need to get to, as this conference has talked about, the openness of the data and who is producing what types of questions, who is producing what types of things within these systems, so that people can truly have transparency. Because the thing that we at least have on our side is the willingness to be transparent. And I think that is really where you get it, so that then everybody can get into the dialogue. And the notion that we can just, we're going to control it, we're going to do it, realize we are serving up these tools for a global stage to be able to interoperate with. And I think that's where we need to step back and understand kind of what are those ideals and what are those goals of everybody around the globe with all these types of technologies and these data repositories. And then are they sticking bad data into it to make it have bad decisions? Or are they going in and asking it questions about people that maybe isn't the right type of thing we care about?
Well, I think these are the kinds of insights that your ad background allows you to see maybe sooner than some of us. But you made some interesting comments to me as we were preparing about the fact that these are advertising systems and that the quality of information that they are capable of producing and their sophistication vis-a-vis what governments themselves have from a regulatory and a fighting back point of view. Want to just go there a little?
I helped IPO the first permission email marketing company in '99 when we did this. And we could see when you opened the email, when you clicked on it, when you went to the shopping cart and you decided that the shipping fee was too high, and then Tuesday at 9:10 a.m. was the best time to go say free shipping. And you would go and you'd get it, and we could predict the response rate, and you could see that. That was almost 20 years ago. The amount of money that's been put into the ability to understand the mindset of a person and how they will respond is bigger than many of these other governments around the world could ever invest into their tools and technologies. And it is the Western commercial tool set that we're providing to all of our consumers that is the apparatus of all of our adversaries. And I think we kind of forget this often, that it is these social media tools that ISIS uses, that all the rest of these things to go and communicate. It is not a separate set. And these tools are amazingly effective. That is how you have brands that have survived for decades, because we're able to go and see when somebody else is trying to sell a product counter to our brand, we're able to protect that brand. We're able to go get people to be inspired about it. We're able to see when they're leaving the brand and going to something else and coming back. We talk about that as selling a product, but you got to remember an ideal is a product. And I think that is where we often forget that somebody else may be trying to sell something different.
And I think just to sort of take what you just said and something you said to me before and try to restate it, you're sort of saying that advertising systems are the best intelligence systems, and they have been weaponized.
Darn right.
Yeah.
And it's too late. Pandora's box is already open. You can't go back.
Wow. Okay, that was very interesting. Mark,
David,
say anything you want.
I'd like to take this back a little further and maybe you wanted to be broad, so a little bit broader.
Please.
If we go back to the invention of the net, we had ARPANET, ScienceNet, these basically very benign science groups talking to each other about how to conduct pure science. And if you did that whole run over time and you did a chart of some kind saying good guys versus bad guys on the system, there were 0 bad guys on day one, basically. It's many years now later, and I think we have many, many more bad guys on the system. It makes sense. It's true for any kind of human system you build. As time goes by, the bad guys figure out how to break into the bank, whatever it's going to be. No matter what you look at today, whether it's bank robbery, a lot of bank robberies happening every day, on the cyber, in the cyber. If you look at the dark net and all the things that are being sold in the dark net and how many people are down there doing business, no one even knows. So I would make the argument, which I have no way of defending whatsoever, that this has been a pretty much straight line story, and that we have increased the amount of negative behavior on the net every day, and it's not going to stop. And it's a dark view of the net. It's not just a dark net. And I have some perspective on this, as I think you know, because we've been looking at the economic side of cyber theft. We might be the best in the world at the meta scale of this. So we watch nations vying with each other. And we've briefed all the 3-letter agencies in the world on this. So we're pretty good at this. And we understand, for instance, what China wants to do with the internet and what they have done for 30 years. So they've been stealing intellectual property from our corporations. BAE Systems is fully briefed on this, I'm sure. So if you care about trade and money and power, and you look at the internet from that perspective, and you're Xi Jinping, your job is to take IP from other nations and commercialize it, sell it half price, and wipe out BAE. That's your job. And they're doing a great job. I don't mean personally, but they're doing a great job at this. If you're Ericsson, if you're Cisco, if you're Nortel Networks, Motorola, Alcatel, make a list of companies either dead or dying because of this project. So when I look at that kind of use of the net, and if we look at it from a global economic perspective, the answer is that's a very effective model that China has, and it's been an extremely negative influence on both global trade and innovation. So I'm deeply concerned that there's a kind of an easy talk way to talk about the internet, and very few solutions, which we talked about this morning at the breakfast meeting, true solutions. We saw NSA create botnets, and they published the papers about it.
Who did that?
Our guys, the NSA guys.
NSA.
They knew how to make botnets a long time ago. We are participating as well as Peter just talked about. So everyone does this, but that's not good necessarily. So will we get to the point where no one in this audience trusts the net for anything? I think we might be there now in a way. I mean, who feels safe about their ID? No one. And they shouldn't, because everyone in here has probably been pawned. So at what stage does the boiling frog get angry? I mean, this is really a bad situation, and I don't see it getting better. So I'm deeply worried that there is just ongoing slow growth of negative behavior, and a bunch of us good guys are tolerating it for some reason, but it's not getting better. And I worry about it on an international scale, and I worry about it on a personal scale.
Well, wait, you've also worked with CFIUS and others, and you've been an advocate for and seen the emergence of treaties on things like intellectual property and China, and they have signed, and I understand you to think that they have moderated their behavior to some degree as a result of their international agreements.
Yes.
Is that the case?
Yes.
So
I
that's
do
a
believe
good thing. That's progress. That is something we could have done that we did, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is that possible to take further?
I don't think so. So in other words, yesterday morning there was a report published that China's back at it again, and that we've just been missing some of this
Back
stuff.
at what exactly?
They're retasking their teams to do APT attacks against commercial enterprises in America, despite the treaty. We think that there are a lot of countries that don't have those treaties that are getting hit by China now.
Okay.
And that China's in a wave of using stolen IP and doesn't need to steal it by cyber means, since they've got 80% of the theft happens through human intelligence.
Let me ask you one thing that's related that I don't think people in this audience have given enough thought to, and I don't know if either of the other panelists have thoughts on this, but I think it should be on the table. If China was smart enough to prevent Facebook from coming into China in 2011, they probably figured it out in many ways a lot earlier. And, Facebook and Google and a lot of other companies, we could list, a list this long, that are operating globally in some fashion that basically have had relatively permeable employment situations. So how likely do you think it is that basically, moles are inside our great tech companies now?
100%.
100%.
Yeah. And I'd go further and say, we could talk at length about the Human Int program from China. It's a gigantic program. But it's equally interesting that if you bring up Facebook twice now, so I won't take that license. Facebook was not the only company in e-commerce prevented from joining the Chinese market. All of them were. And there was a distinct decision at the top that they would copy our business models of our companies, being the West, us, and then reproduce them inside China, and not allow us to come into the Chinese market, even though they could come into our market. They can buy our companies, but we can't buy their companies. And the fact of this unevenness to me is striking. I just don't understand why, whether you're from Britain or America or Germany, when this happens, Germany's kind of waking up now, you go, wait a minute, this isn't a fair trade here. If you can buy my companies, I should be able to buy yours. If you're going to allow Alibaba into America, then we should allow Amazon more traction in China. But that's not the case.
And of course, these Chinese companies are as successful as they are thanks to American capital.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, take a look at Xiaomi from a phone system company. It's like my wife just bought an iPhone 10, and it now finally has a camera that catches up to what we were able to get in Singapore a year ago, but you can't even buy in the United States.
Really?
Now, if you look at every one of the founders who was at Motorola, Google, all the rest of these things,
Apple, yeah.
you probably realize, why they can't be here, because it's probably got a lot of our IP in that. But yet, that's the types of things that you're seeing. I think, while this may be the internet under attack, I think the one thing that has been freeing, and at least we saw this within cyber, was when you finally got to the point of saying, you know what, I cannot trust the systems. It's like when I knew that somebody was going to swipe my credit card and I'm going, fine, how do I go make it so it doesn't matter anymore? There's a freeing level of when you start with this foundation of saying, don't trust it. Presume that they're here. Presume that you have that. Then all of a sudden you can start to go and say, well, if there is no trust in any of this, how could I build that? And if you look at people trying to go and say, don't try and defend my Social Security number. That's not a valid number. Give me a blockchain equivalent. Give me something different. Let me start to build something and say, please don't defend upon my privacy based upon my Social Security number, because it's probably out there.
Right.
I can tell you with OPM attack, there's lots of people who have it now.
Yeah.
You know, but from the rest of these things, if you start there, now all of a sudden we can build upon that. And that's where we need to get this transparency out there, is saying it's happening. Let's quit debating whether it's occurring or not, whether somebody's trying to do this. Let's rapidly get the world to have the view.
This is a
Well, you see private networks being built now. There are whole networks that are dark fiber that are completely aside from the internet.
Right.
And that's kind of the real answer that the big kids have in science and in the military for dealing with this problem.
Okay, quick question. This is a sort of a side question, but the Equifax attack. Were any of the three of, okay, we all were distressed that it occurred. I think we could accept that. Were any of the three of you concerned about your personal data after that attack?
Sure.
You were. You felt that, because my question is based on some of the things you've said. Wouldn't you pretty much assume that all of it was more or less available already in some form to somebody if they really had ill intent?
Yes to both questions. I mean, that doesn't mean you're not
It just means
concerned,
more people had
and
it.
you're
More people had it.
So it's like, okay, there's yet another layer of,
Well, and who had it?
yeah, right.
Because none of that stuff showed up.
Well, many people think that that was a governmental attack.
Right.
Yes, we know that. Yeah, okay. It was, okay, I don't want to go too down there because there's too many other good questions. Rebecca, I wanted to ask you to talk about what you're doing now, the ranking project, because, you know, you've come to some interesting conclusions, not any of them particularly reassuring, but there are some, you know, nuances that are worth mentioning in terms of how you see these various companies in the firmament.
Right. So what we do is we evaluate 22 of the world's biggest, you know, most powerful internet, telecommunications, and mobile companies. We sort of have a global cross-section on kind of 35 different questions that are looking at these companies' policies and commitments and disclosures that affect users' freedom of expression and privacy, including security as well, sort of under as an aspect of privacy. And, you know, the two companies get Ds, everybody else fails, basically. So, you know, the transparency is bad. But one of the points of this project is that, not that transparency is everything, but that transparency is you know, so it's not sufficient, but it's the necessary first step. And that we need greater clarity about, you know, what companies are doing with your data, with whom they're sharing it with. They need, you know, we want for people to be able to see kind of what the differences are in the company's policies and push companies to disclose this, push whether they're doing due diligence, push whether they're doing impact assessments, security assessments, what their, you know, sort of governance mechanisms are for assessing risk, both around privacy and security, but also around expression and content. You know, and I would argue that companies' lack of transparency around how content is policed, how content, you know, is basically how a person's information environment is manipulated and shaped. Total lack of transparency around that has contributed to the problems we have today and has contributed to the mess that these companies have found themselves in because they haven't been clear with other stakeholders, they haven't been clear with regulators, they haven't been clear with the public, and so now there's this big backlash. And that if we get more transparency, we will be able to at least work through some solutions. But what this is really about is exercise of power, right? Because you cannot have accountable governance, you cannot have an open society unless you know who is exercising power against who, to what end, and if they're abusing power, if they're exercising power without consent of the governed.
You mean facts?
Right, yeah, well, there's that.
That fact thing. Yeah.
You know, the fact thing. If nobody has any idea who's exercising power upon whom, against whom, to what end, you can't hold anybody accountable, and then you can't have accountable governance, whether it's private or public governance or anything. So that's where, you know, I'm looking at the corporate transparency piece, but governments are not transparent about the demands they're making on companies, both to censor content or to hand over user data. And there's a big movement to get governments to be more transparent to the maximum, not to, warn the adversary about what they're doing, but at least to have basic level of transparency, that there's accountability that can prevent abuse. And we're very, very far away from that as well. And there are a lot of, government policies and laws around the world, including the democratic world, that are preventing companies from being transparent as well.
I worry
so
deeply about
not
this.
that is the total solution, but it's kind of one step towards figuring out where we go.
I love transparency, and I agree with you, but I worry deeply that that's not really the solution. It's just a good thing. And that, if you're Russia or anybody and you want to control an election, you don't have to pay for ads. You don't have to be identified as the guy who paid for that. You just go in with 100,000 botnet members and start reinforcing your beliefs about whatever. And that creates a division in this country that leads to the next election. And no one will ever be able to break that down. I don't think they're ever going to figure out how to fight that. We'll have our botnets fighting their botnets till the end of time.
Allow me to say one thing on Facebook's behalf and in their defense. You can't really have a botnet inside Facebook. If they were to enforce their identity rules, there would be no bots. The problem is that I think they themselves said the other day that 10% of their identities are fake, which means technically they could be botnets. But it's enforceable. It may take I would strongly predict this will be one of Facebook's biggest responsive efforts in coming months and years to drastically reduce that number of fake accounts that are in there, which can be done by various means.
So since we don't trust their numbers, David, what if it's not 10? What if it's 40?
It's problematic too. I mean, the way they enforce
40%?
What if it's between 20 and 40?
Okay. Well,
the way they're enforcing identity rules, however, is so ham-handed.
Well, they have to get better at that.
So a bunch of women named ISIS had their accounts deactivated a couple years ago.
Right.
There's the human rights
that
activists.
Is true. Yes.
Human rights
it's
activists
probably still true, actually.
Around the world are, whether or not they're using their real name, are the most vulnerable to having their account deactivated because Facebook says we're going to deactivate you unless you provide your passport or something, and they don't. And so, because of the way the flagging mechanism works. So we have some real problems here in terms of...
This is a theme you're making throughout...
how you balance sort of rights and security. Basically, if you're going to really enforce the ID policy, nobody in Egypt who's against the Egyptian
government. Well, look at the Equifax hack you just brought up.
I
mean, how hard would it be for some nation to take that information, you just said it was a nation that stole it probably, and turn that 145 million accounts?
Well, I think it could be made hard. It's just a matter of new systems that don't yet exist. And they should be good enough. I mean, the issue you raise about human rights activists in countries that are repressive not feeling safe on Facebook because they have to use their real names, that is legitimate and is a very tough one to solve. I think they have probably more clever and subtle ways of dealing with that now than we might necessarily know, because Facebook does want to be a positive force. But anyway, your theme is very consistent, though, that the efforts we may make in a democratic country, supposed like ours, that to solve this could really make it worse in other countries.
Well, we need to be thinking globally about this.
No, and I think that's good.
We need to be kind of really assessing, what is the global impact of an action you take in one country.
Which is another way of saying that for all the negatives about these companies, you still see them having a very positive impact globally in many respects.
Sure, they can, absolutely. And there are still a lot of places around the world where independent investigative journalists can't reach audiences any other way than through Facebook and Twitter, and are really dependent on them. And I would argue that if we sort of, in our desire to figure out solutions to this existential crisis we're facing, make it so that civil society in the most embattled places cannot use these networks, then civil society, the weaker that civil society is in transitional places, the worse the attacks are, the worse our security is going to be, actually. I mean, so you actually want, even just from a security perspective, you want to have an approach that strengthens civil society, that strengthens independent voices in Russia, that enables that, they have a space to exist.
Right. But we had this conversation this morning about New York Times, or yesterday, and the fact that Facebook, until very recently, doesn't pay them anything and takes all of their hard work and makes all the ad money off of that. And we're seeing the destruction of what I would call fact-based society because of that kind of behavior by the social networks. So in these countries, not the ones you're talking about, which need to have that access, but the ones where free speech is a really big deal, And democracy is a really big deal. We're degrading our ability to have a democracy, I think.
But this is
because
this is why the headline of the piece in the magazine that I wrote has the word dilemma in it.
Yeah,
this is
right.
not easy.
Well, this
Well,
is where,
one interesting place is a lot of these go into the negative use. In Syria, it was very hard to figure out what was going on with the refugees.
Right.
Instagram was actually the best social media network because people do not have Androids and iPhones and high-dollar phones. They had ones that could take a picture. It is also one you didn't have to type a lot for. And they were able to rapidly start posting, here's pictures of what's happening, and we were able to go and really able to see what was going on over there.
Yeah.
You know, what was happening in that refugee crisis in real time as it was coming out from those pieces, from these networks doing it, and gave a voice to a population that had no voice. They were in a land that was not even their own, and many of them of where they were able to go do this. And so there is many valuable benefits to these things. What we need to understand, though, is that these systems are all being used in so many different types of ways, and that was not what they were conceived to be. You know, we're arguing over whether there was 10% or 40% of the people inside Facebook are fake accounts. But yet we sat here for a day and a half and talked about people saying it's augmented humans. So fine, let's go find 20 people willing to give up their real identity, go have a computer or a bot or whatever, be able to augment one person to act like 50 online. These things already exist out there. We're armies, and they can have a huge voice.
Just to throw in another thing, John Kelly on this stage this morning said the future security battle is going to be AI versus AI. And if you listen to Facebook and Google talk about how they think these problems will be solved, it's AI this and AI that. That's how they think. But it's going to continue inside. It's challenging. I want to get some audience voices in here because I know there's some interesting people here, as there have been throughout these 2 days. Okay, please. Identify yourself.
I am Janice Nickel. So this is kind of a dreamer comment question, which kind of takes, you know, talked about blockchain, and that brings trust and verification into transactions. Is there any way that there could be an analogous way of verifying and bringing trust into software?
All right, there's a bunch of things that are digital identity. And if you think of, for example, AI is software, it is algorithms. And one can go in and say, hey, I've made my algorithm visible. And just if you take the simple notion that was talked about here, where this is how it prioritizes decisions, whether it's for, like as in Roku talking about it, it's going to be the lowest cost for those, or whether it's the most relevant type news, we can put integrity around it. And I think that's really where, when you're getting, whether it's a blockchain or the rest, saying that was the algorithm what we promoted for somebody to look at and review. The system can say whether or not that is really still the one that's there and did it work, and you can get these voting type systems that are in there.
But
But you have to start with, presume today you have no trust. How would you overlay a trust-based system? Blockchain is one technology that can be used for that. If you start getting there, now all of a sudden we can start to have a debate.
Well, this is a subject that I've heard a lot of people talk about over the last couple of years. Union Square Ventures, notably, has talked about blockchain-based alternatives to these social networks for a time, and they're investing in it. And I have heard recently that some of the biggest players are putting some serious money behind systems of this type. So we may see some interesting developments. I saw a hand over here. Let's get the mic there.
Thank you, Dan Elron. Maybe the traditional internet is kind of dead, as we discussed the past couple of days, but I want to connect the two sessions, this one and the previous one. We're just beginning, kind of, with IoT. And so should we trust the IoT to the current internet? Should we wait? What kind of solutions do you panel members have? And will you connect your own home devices that can do things, and maybe your pacemaker, et cetera, to the current internet?
Dan always asks good questions. And, you know, throw 5G into that, too, because it really does create a different technical set of capabilities.
Be scared.
Yeah, it's a complete nightmare.
I just published a thing on LinkedIn for Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and I'm like, why should my garage door opener be talking to the house, sitting behind the firewall, talking to my car on all these networks, of which no device in that entire food chain is even able to upgrade the firmware?
Yeah.
And who knows who wrote it and what there is inside.
Wait, I just have to say, I just saw a headline yesterday, connected door locks take off.
I unplugged all of our Alexa devices in the office, in the house. We don't have any of that stuff. We don't have any locks like that.
You wouldn't
buy
have
the
it either?
Amazon lock.
I'm not living
It's a
scared.
complete nightmare, Dan.
No.
If you live scared, you give up.
But
I'm going to go look at my living room on Nest right now.
So my project, we actually
Easy
have
to hack.
we're collaborating with Consumer Reports, and while Ranking Digital Rights looks kind of more at the not in Internet of Things companies so much, we're working with Consumer Reports to start examining, the policies and disclosures of the companies running, everything from smart toys to smart TVs to fitness trackers, and their disclosures and their governance and security audit is so much worse than the D's and F's that we're seeing in the more kind of conventional.
It's like we have two
space.
types of brain going. One is the build it fast, internet or whatever, IoT brain. The other one is like, the security thing later for that.
Right.
We just
We
can't
can't
get
do
ahead of
that
ourselves.
anymore.
Well,
Security
well,
has to be at the beginning.
Yeah.
Well,
And it's
as I think I commented in the breakfast session, it's like putting drugs out there without testing them, or putting cars on the road without ever having crash tested them or anything.
Yeah.
We're just sticking all this stuff out there and figure it out later. The human cost is going to be
Yep.
existential, if not catastrophic.
It's not secure.
And again, to make another statement in the attempt to be fair to the internet giants, it's not only their responsibility. I mean, we essentially have a government that's been asleep at the wheel about this.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think they get more blame than Facebook, Google, and the other internet giants. I mean, if it wasn't for Senator Warner, there almost would be no one in the Senate who even knows what questions to ask.
Well, let's say something nice about China. Let's say something not so nice. Their guys are totally qualified. The people who run China generally have been to MIT or Harvard or some other place like that.
PhD engineers.
They're engineer PhDs. They have managed many levels of government. They know how to build a bridge. They're brilliant engineering, and they know all about tech. As you've just said, in the entire 535 we have in D.C., maybe Mark Warner is the only guy.
Yeah, well, that's the pitch that you hear in Beijing for why their system is better and why Africa and everybody else should adopt theirs and not ours, right?
It's an interesting question that you could actually go to down the road is, how could we create a political system where technically and, psychologically competent government officials could ever emerge in a system like ours? At the moment, it's not something to be too optimistic about.
No.
Anyway, okay, who else?
You need radical political.
Somebody else have their hand? There must be. Okay, right here. And then over here.
One of the best panels of the economy this year. Great stuff, terrific guys. I wanted to go back, David, to what you were mentioning about identity verification and so on. And I find it appalling.
Identify yourself first.
Sorry, Alessandro Vigilante from Fidelity. So I find it appalling today that coming into the US, I had to provide, it was impossible for me to get a mobile phone, a credit card, a bank account, water services at home, internet, a lease agreement, anything, impossible. Nonetheless, I used to be a freelancer. I used to run my own AdWords campaign on Google without providing absolutely anything. Luckily, I'm not a hitman, but I could have sold anything, absolutely anything on Google without any of the regulation that I need to go through for all of these things. Even in Airbnb, I don't let anyone in my house without a government issue ID. So I don't understand, why is it such an utopia to think that Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on should go to a proper government certified ID before onboarding a new user?
Yeah.
Google spends $10 million a year on lobbying.
On what?
Lobbying.
Well, there's, I mean, with ID, again, if you're, that might work within certain types of jurisdictions, but if you're a global platform and you actually want to serve users in countries where if your internet activity is connected to your passport ID, you're in jail. Even though you're doing things that are supposed to be protected under international human rights law, there's some issues there. So,
well, the trend is each country has its own internet, and this whole thing just changes radically. And China has its own.
And your
already.
concern,
Right, well, that's the trend.
Just to clarify and restate, your concern is that anything we do in the quasi-democratic countries to try to regulate this will be copied in its most controlling and authoritarian aspects in other countries and used as a justification.
or will have impacts.
Yeah.
You just need to consider, if you're regulating a global platform, kind of what what is the impact going to be, not just on a teenager in Menlo Park, but on a user
Yeah, but
in a range of, on your most at-risk
Okay,
users.
I
Or
got an idea for you.
Even on, people in the United States who have good reasons to, fear for their privacy, victims of domestic abuse or people with certain orientations in certain communities that, are
Well, that was the
hostile
Google
to,
hack.
right?
China went after Stanford students who were standing up for human rights in China.
Well, what if there were an extra-national entity that issued the IDs?
But why do we need an ID when the site knows what you're going to buy and who you are before you ever get there? In some of these types of things, we sit here and we talk about this, and the sites already know who you are, what you're going to buy. The ads kill me with, I'm like, guys, please, I already bought it yesterday, turn them off. It's the type of thing that they're so dead on accurate, but yet we're trying to do this. We still don't even have all the states onto an ID that we're going to even accept at, TSA, and we're all confined to an old world notion of I'm going to get an ID and a passport, when the internet knows exactly who you are and has for quite a long time.
But wait a minute. Now, you also, we have to end, but you're a believer that the information will out, because you haven't really said it quite that way, but on the phone you said to me, you're still confident that you can't really suppress bad stuff the way you used to, despite all of the bad things we've been talking about on this panel. Right. Okay. But you also, if you take your analysis of the internet's targeting capabilities based on the ad technology literally, then Rebecca's point about human rights activists is basically moot, because they no longer have any anonymity.
Correct. There is no anonymity on the internet. It is long since gone. And that is this premise that's there. And in every case, the only difference of what people find is time. How long is it until enough of the data was analyzed to go back and say who said it when?
But okay, that is a disturbing indicator that for all of her human rights activism and legitimate concerns, as dictators around the world gain more technological competence, we basically will have no ability to fight back. So the question is, it's again the arms race of the empowered citizenry versus the empowered governments, and that's scary.
But separate the notion of you as a person are able to fight only because you're anonymous. Separate it from the freedoms that we protect in the West is that, no, everybody should be able to have a voice. And the difference is that, if we think that then something puts ourselves at risk because we say it, then we need to defend that. But don't go and think that the only way we could say something is because nobody knows who I am, because eventually somebody will get a hold of Watson. They'll get a hold of all these databases. They'll get a hold of them, and you'll be able to go back in time. And that is the issue. And so, sure, today you might not know who I am when I say something on some account. But eventually you will know that account is me.
It is, I mean, we do have to end, but it's interesting, just an observation, if we worry about dictators because of this kind of logic, at the same time, today's New York Times, they're like hammering at this issue of money laundering by literally everybody. Even Bono is getting, and the Queen Elizabeth in today's New York Times is being accused of money laundering.
Paradise
right?
Paper, yeah.
So it's again a consequence of internet-based transparency that we can have these revelations.
Right.
So this arms race is so sophisticatedly complex, but it almost suggests that these Central, Asian dictators will probably have their money exposed at some point too. And those are the worst people in the world. So maybe they won't be able to
But
identify.
will it bring them down or not, or will they be able to prevent?
Well, then we go back,
that
they'll have their own
information
internet.
from
Well,
getting
let me ask you
around
this to end.
Right.
Let me ask you to end by predicting long-term human rights, optimism or pessimism?
Very long term, my father's a historian. Very long term, I'm optimistic. Next 100 years, not so much.
Oh, God. Okay, well, that's a sad way to end. Thank you so much.